Okay, guys. So we've got the first cut on the Ford 4.0 liter. I did hit it with a shot of Dicam. Don't see anything on the chamber at all. See a little bit in the bowl. The valve job was dull, dead beaver teeth, quickie. The guides are quite a bit worn out, which is probably the reason these heads cracked. Because if the valve can't get rid of the heat, then the seat overheats, and before you know it, you have a temperature runaway situation and cracks the head. So these also have a smaller diameter stem. Let me measure that stem. Okay, stems measure 8 millimeters, but these were quite a bit worn out. In fact, the guide that I put in there for the Sioux was, even the oversized one was floppy in there. So, what did I do? Well, I guess we can compare stocker, bowl, to the non-stock bowl. Yeah, quite a bit of that guide came out. It had a decent thickness on the roof. Let's take a look. This part you can see has got a decent amount of thickness, but in here, where you really could make some gains, there's not that much there. It looks like there's a lot because the guide's in the way, but there's not that much there, so you can't go crazy raising the roof. Overall, like, this looks really thick, but it's not. Look at how it's real thick in the center, and there's less on the sides. I noticed that in a couple spots where they should have extra material. They just don't. Now, as far as the bowl shape, the back of that bowl is way too straight. That should be, as far as I'm concerned, that should be leaning on an angle like this a little bit more. And let me throw a valve in here. Take a look at how tightly shrouded that is around that. They're really preventing a lot of the flow from coming around the short side radius on the stocker. Now, what I did is I plunged cut that and gave it a little more room around there. I didn't go crazy. I took a small amount off and put a little bit of a radius on it, but not much. It's still relatively square, like the stocker is. Okay. As far as this part of the chamber, I worked on the transition a little bit, and I widened it a little bit, and I brought it out to the gasket line a little bit more, but I didn't go. If you notice the stock shape, it's really not that much different than the stock shape. The exhaust I didn't touch because they actually did a nice job deshrouding the exhaust. I mean, take a look at how around the periphery of that valve is very even. That's actually quite good. So I didn't change any of that. Now, let's see if we can add some light to it. Okay, the exhaust port, I just really don't like. This wall is quite thin, so you can't do much with it. And it comes right down to the guide boss. Okay? This side comes down quite a bit, but look at the direction it's in. It's designed to get the flow from the center of the cylinder over. I'm like, okay, that's fine. But then you got to turn it to get it out of the port. Now, to turn it is going to take a little bit of work. How did I do? Well, we'll look at the flows in a little bit, but we're going to go over some engineering on these first, and you can give them a passing grade or a failing grade according to how you feel. You can see, let's move my light. Okay, you can only do so much on this. Now, I was able to cut a seat. Notice the seat's still quite wide. It's a quickie beaver teeth cut. And then I did my burr radius. But you can't do much with this wall. There's not a lot of metal here. You know, you can take some of the meat around this guide off and blend it in. This way you can make it a touch bigger, but is that really going to help? It gives it a little more area to turn, right? You can see this area has got a much nicer shape than what the stocker looks like. Relatively squared, right? Now, I didn't polish the short side radiuses on these. I just did them quick with a burr, threw them on the bench. As far as the valves, they were in rough shape. So I just gave them a cleanup. I'll show you the intake. Okay, in the intake, I gave it quite a deep back cut at a 30. So it's a 45 seat with a 30 back cut. The original back cut on the valve, I don't know if you guys can see it, this filthy valve, but there is a back cut on here. Tough to see, but there actually is a back cut under all that coked up garbage. Now guys, where does that come from? Does anybody know? We'll leave that as a question, and we'll answer it in the comments, but we talked about it a little bit already today. Okay, so these are stock valve sizes. It's 1.71 intake, 1.35 exhaust. They're pretty small, right? Let's take a look at these ports at a little bit different angle. Okay, let's take a look. You know what, we need to compare the stock one first. All right, notice how big that boss is. And the stock one, I went over and took the huge amount of carbon and coke out of it. Some important things to notice is this bulge here. What is that bulge for? Well, it's got a 3/8/16 bolt hole that does the rocker arms here. So I machined that out, but I didn't know how far I could go before I went through. I could cut them up, and if I cared, I can get a little more out of it maybe. But I do think it's interesting how even the stock roof, take a look at the stock roof, how one is quite a bit higher than the other, right? The side that's got the curb, which is the left side, is much deeper bowl than the relatively straight wall. And I actually kept it that way. Okay? Looks like I could have straightened that wall out a little bit on the left, now that I see the reflection on it. We'll have to take a look at the roof speeds and see if I goof that up. Now, my first cut, all I did is I said, I gave it a look and I said, all right, I think it could use some more area here, some more area there. So what did I wind up doing? Well, I fixed a lot of that, the roof of that port. I took that guide and shrank it quite a bit because there's no reason for a big guide like that. I did straighten the left wall out a little bit, but the walls are relatively thin, so you can't take a ton of metal out of them. And I raised it a little bit, but you can't take a ton of metal out of them. As far as the short side radius, it's a bit wider, but it does have quite a bit different shape. Let's take a look at that. Okay, now I do have some experience with very flat ports like this. And what they really seem to like is to angle the apex of the short side radius down towards the center quite a bit. Now, I did that a little bit on this, but, you know, the short side, like I said, it looks like it's really thick, but it's really not. So I wasn't going to make holes in it. Okay. Like I said, I didn't polish any of that. And you can see it's basically radius right to that seat. I would usually like a throat cut, at least a 60, but this was such a mess I decided to radius it. Okay, as far as this part of the port, what can you do with it? It is what it is. Basically, you take some lumps and bumps off, made the short side a little bit wider. Right, the bowl is not a good shape, so there's not much you can do with it. In fact, back wall, you still see it has that big line. I barely took any metal off that back wall at all because it's too straight to begin with. Okay. See if we can see these sides at all. I don't see blue anywhere. It looks like there's just a shadow going over that short side radius there on that curved wall. Okay, zooming all the way in, you can see it's got a very flat port. Okay, you can see how I angled the short side radius towards the center a little bit to get more through that tight corner, because that's going to be the fast corner on the right hand side. The other side where it has area is going to go much slower. And then the port stays that way until it trumpets out at the end. I would have never designed it that way. But that's what we got. How much different is that than the Stocker? Let's move the light. It's not really tremendously different, really. It's more like giving it a bit of a tune-up more than anything else. It's not a full-off changing of the design, because you just don't have the metal to do it. I mean, if we look at our exhaust cutaway, we could measure that, but it's just a touch over 100 thousandths. So, oh, another thing that's important, let's take a good look at the casting, especially this one that's broken. No inserts. Right on the cast iron. Could inserts have saved it from cracking? If it was designed for inserts, yeah, that would be good. But still, when the guides wear, it's gonna lend to a temperature runaway situation. And you can tell the guides were shot by the way the seat's worn. Look at how fat that seat is. On the intake, on the exhaust and the intake, the seats are very wide. That's from hitting the seat at an angle because the guides are loose, and then centering themselves. Wears the guides right out. Okay, you can see in this shot the angle on that short side radius. Now, how much different is it than the Stocker? Let me move this light. Much harder to see on the Stocker because it's still dark. It doesn't get the reflective light from the cuttered finish. But you can see that is much flatter short side radius in reference to the seat. What can we say about the intake port design looking at it like this? I mean, overall, the short side radius looks pretty good. I mean, it does have a big flat cut there, right? So that's not really ideal. But they did that when they did the valve job. That's the 60 that they put in there. And they have it completely choked off. So what do you think they're doing with the airflow? Do they want a lot of air to go across the short side, or are they trying to force everything back to this deep bowl that it really shouldn't have? Now this had the clean spot right here where the fuel was hitting. Right there, actually. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, pretty cool. Okay, here's the one that hasn't been cleaned. You can see right where the fuel's hitting, it washes that coked up deposits right off. Alright, I took some notes because I don't know anything about 4 liters. So, in 1965, they started production. It was 2 liters. This is actually designed in Germany, which makes sense why the ports look a lot like Volkswagens, probably. It's a 60-degree V6. If it's like most 60-degree V6s, that does give you 120 degrees between the strokes, which is a nice even fire. I know the GM 60-degree V6s have a firing order literally of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At least they used to. I remember I did a 2.8 liter ages ago. This actually reminds me a lot of the 2.8 liter. And they actually ran quite well. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 firing order. I thought that was interesting. Okay, we talked about the valve sizes. Comes cracked from the factory. It's a joke, but it's one of our comments was right around 120,000 miles they crack. Probably about the same time the guides start to take a hike. Half the intake valve is shrouded. Now, do you think they're doing that for airspeed on the short side radius, or they're really trying... They're blocking it on this side so they get more flow this side for your swirl? It's an interesting question, right? Because on the 318 swirl ports, the 302s, it's done for swirl, right? They want that turbulent charge coming out at an angle. This, they may be doing the same thing. Okay, flat valve angle. Flat valve angle is... It's good for, certain things. Like, you don't need valve reliefs or anything in the pistons. That's nice. Gives you a little more clearance. But makes a compact chamber. So I'm sure these had dish pistons. Earlier models had a larger exhaust port. I was talking about that when I was cutting these up. And let me show you. It looks like they didn't change the exhaust manifold. See how much bigger the original ports were? So they trumpeted out much bigger, which is not the correct way to do an exhaust port. So let's see what we got bone stock, and let's see what we got with some porting. Okay, these are our stockers. They actually are not horrendous. Those hang pretty much with a Mustang GT50 E7 head. Very close, actually. Actually, I think they flow a little more. E7s only flow about 160. And like 118 on 115 on the exhaust, so they're a touch better. I did think it was interesting. Look at how quick we hit our swirl at 2500. It's already skipping over the short side radius at 0.25 lift. And you're getting a bunch of swirl. Now, how'd we do as far as first cut? Minus at the very lowest lift, plus, 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 plus. Notice we had a little bit of noise at 0.25. After porting it moved to 0.3. Okay, decent gains on the intake. Now, does the swirl follow suit? Where I deshrouded the intake valve a little bit, looks like we got a touch less swirl, except around 0.15, 0.2, we have more swirl. Everything else looks a little bit less. Interesting, right? And the exhaust got quite a bit better. Considering there really wasn't much to do with the exhaust, I think that angled short side radius picks it up quite a bit. I remember doing 8-valve Volkswagen heads. They really liked that, and they had a very similar port. So somebody asked, why would we waste any time with these at all? Well, one, I had it. I needed to get away from Mission Impossible for a little bit to clear my head. And two, you take something like this, there's something to learn. Even if you just look at the different engineering that went on. Whether you agree with the engineering or you don't agree with the engineering. Let's take a quick look at our speeds. Let me put the pluses and minuses in. Okay. That's the unported speeds, right? And the ported speeds. Up, up, up. Everywhere on the intake port because you're moving quite a bit more air. And on the exhaust, we lost in a couple spots, but it's a lot more even. Take a look at how dead that was right in the center and that bottom lower corner. Dead. Okay. Definitely picked up quite a bit in the center. That one corner stayed dead. Interesting, right, guys? But we got a bunch that are in the 300s, which is good. All right, guys, 20 whole minutes already. And I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff I forgot to talk about. But thanks for putting up with the 4-liter stuff. I do have a treat for you this weekend. I went to the car show with Casey, and he gave me that intake manifold and the spacer. Well, we ran into one of his buddies, and him and I kind of hit it off, Long Islander. So he's going to be coming by this weekend, and he's bringing some Mopar stuff, and we're going to do a little experimenting and maybe a couple of videos on it. And I may even do a little porting lesson with him. Maybe I'll do an intake and an exhaust and a chamber, and he can finish them up. In any case, they're one of those small block Mopar heads that everyone loves. So that's a little tidbit for what's coming up. All right, guys. Thanks for hanging out. Have a good night.